Hello students, welcome to class 9 English. Students, let us move on to the next chapter, that is 3 questions. We all have so many questions in our mind. Do we find answers for that? Yes, naturally, all our questions, whatever is there in our mind, will be answered. Let us see who has been asking these 3 questions and whether the person gets the answer for these 3 questions here. We'll know about the author, Count Leo Tolstoy. He is a Russian novelist and a moral philosopher. Who is a philosopher? One who speaks about life, one who talks about lives, who involves the stories. Most of the stories are based on moral values of life. And he's ranked as one of the world's greatest writer. And the greatest novel ever written is War and Peace. His ability to weave stories, the way he forms stories, and his wonderful characters and his narrative capabilities are appreciated in every part of the world, even today. Before we go to the chapter, let us see what are these 3 questions about. Now, a king has 3 questions and he is seeking answers to them. What are those questions? Does he find the answers for it? Let us read on to the lesson. Children, you need to follow page number 31 onwards in your textbook in order to read the lesson. Let's begin with now. A thought came to a king that if he knew 3 things, he would never fail in life. So the 3 questions arises in the mind of a king, thinking that if he had known the answers for these, he would be a very successful person in life. What are those questions? What is the right time to begin something? Who should a king listen to? And what is the most important thing for a king to do? So 3 questions. What is the right time to do some work? And who should a king listen to? Whose advice should he take? And what is the important work that is for a king to do? So these were the 3 questions which arose in the mind of a king. And to find answers, he sent messengers throughout his kingdom, and he even promised a large sum of money to anyone who would answer these 3 questions. And many wise men came to the king, but they all answered his questions in a very different manner, which was not satisfactory to the king. The king gets different kinds of answers for his questions. And for his first question, he found that some had given an answer that the king must prepare a timetable and then follow it strictly. Others said it was impossible to decide in advance the right time for doing something. So what was the question? What is the right time to begin something? So each one gave different answers, and the king should do whatever seemed necessary at that time. At that particular time, whatever is important, the king should do. And many others said that the king needed a council of wise men who would help him act at the proper time. Who is a council? A group of people chosen to advise, means the ministry. So yes, somebody said that he needed to take the advice of those people. But then others said that there were some things which could be very urgent. He needn't wait for that group of people there. So these things could not wait for the decision of the council. So in order to decide the right time for doing something, it is necessary to look into the future, and only magicians could do that. The king therefore would have to go to the magicians. So in their answers to the second question, some said that people most necessary to the king were his counselors. Others said priest. A few others said doctors, and yet others said that it was soldiers, that they were very important person to the king. For the question, who should a king listen to? People felt they should listen to the king should listen to different kinds of people. Each one's answer was very different. And to the third question, that is, what is the most important thing for a king to do? What is the most important work for a king to do? Many suggested that the king had to fight, he had to attack, and others said to do some religious worship. So king was not satisfied with these answers, so he decided to seek the advice of a certain hermit who was widely known for his wisdom. Now, who is a hermit? A person who lives alone and leads a very simple life, like an ascetic life. So he decided to go and take advice from that wise man. The king decides to meet the hermit, and so he doesn't want to go in his original appearance. He puts on ordinary clothes and he went to meet the hermit. And before he reached the hermit's hut, he left his horse and bodyguard somewhere outside and went alone. He did not want to show himself as a king. He went as a common, ordinary person to the hermit. And as he came near the hermit's hut, he saw the hermit digging the ground in front of his hut. He was busy working. He greeted the king, but he continued his work. And the king went up to the hermit and said, I have come to you, wise hermit, to ask you to answer 3 questions. So the king forwards his problem and he repeated the questions what he wanted to get the answers. The 3 questions what were in the mind of the king he repeats in front of the hermit. The hermit listened to the king but he did not speak. So the king feels that the hermit is tired. So he says that let me take the spade and work in your place. So the king approaches himself to work for the hermit. Hermit just thanks him and he gives the spade to the king and he moves aside. When the king had dug 2 beds, he stopped and repeated his questions. So, what is the digging bed? He made heaps of mud in order to plant some saplings or something as such. And then, even though he repeated his questions, the hermit gave no answer to the king. Hours passed, and that there was no sign from the hermit that he would answer the king's questions. The sun went down behind the trees, that it's almost sunset of the day, and at last the king stuck the spade into the ground. He was tired, waiting for the answers. He just threw the spade into the ground, and spade is an instrument what you use to dig the ground. So he just came to the hermit and he says, I came to you, wise man, to get answers to my questions. If you can give no answer, tell me so, and I will return home. So the king expresses his view, saying that if the hermit was unable to give the answer, he would return back home. By then, hermit sees someone coming running towards them. Here comes someone running, says the hermit. And the king turned round and saw a bearded man running towards them. A stranger with a beard, he comes running towards them. He had pressed his hands against his stomach, from which blood was flowing. When he reached the king, he fainted. That shows that the man was wounded actually. And as the moment he reached towards the king, he fainted and fell to the ground. The king and the hermit removes the man's clothing and they found a large wound in his stomach. He was already wounded by somebody, and the king washed and covered the wound with his handkerchief, but the blood would not stop flowing. The king redressed the wound until at last the bleeding stopped. So the king nursed the man who had come wounded over there. The bearded man seeks forgiveness from the king. For what reason? Let us see now. So after the hermit and the king dressed the wound of the bearded man, he closed his eyes and he lay quiet. By then the king was very tired by the day's work, and he also lay down on the floor and slept through the night. When the king woke up, it was several minutes before he could remember where he was. He was not very sure where he was lying down, and who the stranger bearded man was lying towards him. He didn't know who the person was too. By then, that man speaks. The bearded man says, Forgive me, in a very weak voice, when he sees the king awake. The king says, I do not know you and have nothing to forgive you for. The king doesn't know who the person is and for what reason he has to be forgiven. So the person says, You do not know me, but I know you. The bearded man says the king may not be knowing him, but he knew him. He was his enemy who swore revenge on the king, because the king had put his brother to death and had seized his property too. What had the king done to the bearded man? He had once upon a time put his brother to death. He had killed his brother and also had taken his property. And the bearded man had made up his mind to kill the king on his way back from the hermit's house. When the king was supposed to move back from the hermit's house, this man had decided that he would kill him. But the whole day passed when the king did not return from the hermit's house. So this person left his hiding place and he came upon his bodyguard. The bodyguard was waiting with the horse outside somewhere, and that person had recognized this man and had wounded him. That was how the bearded man was wounded. And so he continues saying that I wish to kill you and you have saved my life. Now, if I live, I will serve you as your most faithful servant. So the wounded man says that even though he preferred to kill the king had saved his life unknowingly. But still, for that reason, forever in his life, he would remain as most faithful towards the king. King makes peace with his enemy now. They have become friends. Now the king was very happy to have made peace with his enemy and so easily, and he also had gained the faith that he had become his friend. So the king not only forgave the bearded man but also promised him to give back his property. He says that his property also will be given back. And leaving the wounded man there itself, the king goes out of the hut. Out of the hut, looks around for the hermit. He goes to the hermit and says that, for the last time, I beg you to answer my questions, wise man. He requests the wise man to answer his questions again. So the hermit gives an answer saying that you have already been answered. So all your questions are answered already. So king was puzzled. He says, how have I been answered? What do you mean? So the king feels that the hermit had never opened his mouth to say anything, and how could he be answered? So there is a puzzle in his mind. So the king is in a question mark again. Which says to the king, in the whole day's work and action, he had found answers for his question. He says that if the king had not pitied the weakness of the hermit yesterday, the previous day, and had not dug the beds for him, he would have gone away. If the king had not taken the work of the hermit and done, and seeing that the hermit not answering his questions, if he had gone out of the hut, what would have happened? That bearded man would have attacked him. And so the most important time was when the king was digging the beds. So the question was, what is the right time to begin something? So here the answer was, so when he was digging the beds, that was the most important time for him. And the hermit was the most important man. And to do me good was your most important business, says the hermit. So the most important man was whom? It was hermit, because he was with the king at that time. And the king helping him out in his work was the most important work. And later, and that bearded man came running towards him. So he had cared, the king was nursing him, and because if you had not dressed his wounds, he would have died without having made peace with you, says the hermit. The hermit says that if had not treated that bearded man, he would have died away without making any agreement, peace with the king. So he was the most important man, and what the king had done for him was the most important business. So the hermit says, remember then, there is only one time that is important, and that time is now. Anything good you need to do is at that right particular time you need to do. And it is the most important time because that is the only time each and everyone have the power to act. You can't wait for a situation to happen. At that particular situation, what you need to do, you need to react according to that. And the most necessary person is the person you are with at that particular moment. And whenever a situation arises at that particular moment, either in your time of difficulty or anything, whoever stays with you, that person becomes very important for you. And the most important business is to do that person good, because we are sent into this world for that purpose alone, says the hermit. So whenever a person is with you and you do something good to that person, and that is the most important work for us to do, either helping out that person or helping him to do any good work. So that is what the hermit says, why we are sent to this world, for this purpose alone, that is to do good to others. So the lesson gives a message that there are no questions which are not answered. Any question in our mind can be answered, and there are three important things, that is the right time to do something, and to whom we should listen in life, and what is the important work for us to do.